The air in the courtroom was thick and still, like the air in a forgotten attic. It smelled of old paper, polished wood, and the faint, metallic temps of anxiety. Sunlight struggled through a high, grimy window, slicing through the dusty atmosphere and illuminating motes of dust, dancing in the golden beam. At a simple wooden table, two young women sat side by side, a fortress of calm in a sea of tension. They were identical, not just in their matching dark blazers and neat buns, but in the way they held themselves with a quiet, shared confidence that seemed to draw its strength from their proximity. They were Alara and Lyra, the owners of a small shop called the Gilded Leaf. And today, they were fighting for its soul. Their opponent wasn't a person, not really. It was a thick file of zoning regulations and a city ordinance that was as clear as mud. The issue was a sign. Not a flashing, garish neon sign, but a beautiful hand-carved wooden sign that hung above their shop's door. It was a work of art, depicting a gilded leaf with intricate veins that caught the light. A piece Alara had spent weeks designing, and Lyra had spent weeks perfecting with a delicate chisel. They believed it added to the historic charm of the street, a characterful welcome in a world of generic vinyl banners. The city, however, saw it as a violation. And so, here they were, in the cavernous, intimidating courtroom of Judge Alistair Finch. Alara, the elder by a mere 7 minutes, shuffled their papers. Her hands were steady, but her heart was performing a frantic drum solo against her ribs. She glanced at Lyra, whose gaze was fixed on the judge's empty bench. Lyra gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was their silent language, a lifetime of communication condensed into a single look. It meant, asterisk, we are ready. We have prepared. We are right, asterisk, they had prepared for weeks. They weren't lawyers, but they were researchers. Trained in the meticulous art of botany and chemistry, skills they had applied to the law with the same precision they used to identify rare herbs. They had cross-referenced every clause, found precedents in neighboring towns, built a case that was logical, fact-based, and they believed unassailable. Their folder was organized with color-coded tabs, each document highlighted and annotated. They had rehearsed their argument with Alara as the primary speaker and Lyra ready to step in with supporting details. They felt like they were bringing a perfectly cultivated rare orchid to a vegetable contest. Certain of its unique beauty and quality, a heavy wooden door at the side of the room creaked open, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. The low murmur that had been buzzing through the small crowd of onlookers died. A clerk, who had been typing with a rhythmic clack, froze over her keyboard. Every eye, including Alara and Lyra's, turned to the man who strode towards the bench. Judge Alistair Finch was a man carved from the same stern wood as the courtroom itself. He was in his late 60s, with a face that seemed to be permanently set in an expression of profound disappointment. His robes were a crisp, unforgiving black, and he moved with a weight that suggested he carried the burdens of the world on his shoulders and was annoyed by their heaviness. He didn't look at anyone as he took his seat, settling into his backed chair like a king on a throne. He shuffled a few papers, his movements sharp and impatient. The clerk cleared her throat. All rise for the Honorable Judge Alistair Finch. Lara and Lyra stood, their backs straight. They watched as he finally looked down from his perch, his eyes scanning the room not with curiosity, but with a kind of weary disdain. His gaze swept over them, pausing for a fraction of a second too long, a look that took in their youth, their identical features, and their neat but clearly not expensive clothes. It was a look that dismissed them before they had even spoken. "You may be seated," he said, his voice a low, gravelly boom that seemed to vibrate through the wooden floorboards. He picked up their file, holding it by the corner as if it were contaminated. He flipped through the pages with alarming speed, not reading, but skimming, his brow furrowed, not in concentration, but in annoyance. He tossed the file back onto his desk with a soft thud that echoed in the silent room. "The city versus the Gilded Leaf," he said, leaning into his microphone. His voice, now amplified, filled every corner of the room, leaving no place to hide. "The counselors are present. Let's hear it." Lara took a deep breath, the kind she practiced before giving a presentation to a tough crowd. She stood up, smoothing her skirt. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and steady. "Thank you for the opportunity to be heard today. My sister and I are here to appeal the citation issued against our business. We believe the ordinance in question, specifically Section 4B regarding signage, is being applied retroactively and without consideration for the artistic and historical merit of our—" She didn't even get to finish the sentence. "Stop." The judge's voice cut through hers like a shard of glass. It wasn't loud, but it was absolute. Ilara froze, mid-sentence. A flicker of confusion crossed her face. Judge Finch leaned forward, his elbows resting on the bench, and steepled his fingers. He looked directly at Ilara, but his eyes seemed to be looking right through her, at some idea of her he had already constructed in his mind. "Let me save us all some time, young lady," he said, his voice dripping with a condescension that was so thick it was almost a physical presence. "I have been on this bench for 27 years. I have heard thousands of cases. Do not think for a moment that you are going to discover some magical loophole in a city ordinance that dozens of lawyers have missed." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. He then turned his attention to the full courtroom, his voice booming again. "It seems we have a new generation of entrepreneurs who believe that passion is a substitute for preparation, that a cute little idea is all it takes to succeed in the adult world." A hot flush of shame crept up Ilara's neck. She could feel the eyes of the people in the room on her. She risked a glance at Lyra, who had gone perfectly still, her face pale, her hands clenched into tight fists in her lap. The shared look of confidence from earlier was gone, replaced by a raw, naked shock. "You run a tea shop, is it?" The judge continued, picking up their file again and waving it casually. "The Gilded Leaf. Charming. I'm sure it's a lovely hobby. But the law is not a hobby. It is a serious business, built on rules, regulations, and precedents. Rules that exist for a reason. To create order, to ensure fairness, to prevent chaos." He stood up and began to pace behind his bench, a caged animal circling its enclosure. "You come in here with your colored tabs and your highlighted notes," he said, gesturing dismissively at their meticulously prepared folder. "You think you've done your homework? You've read a few paragraphs, you've Googled a few cases, you've crafted a little story in your head about how you're the righteous underdog fighting against the big bad city. It's a nice narrative. It's the kind of thing that makes for a feel-good movie. But this is not a movie. This is my courtroom." He stopped pacing and leaned forward again, his voice lowering to a more menacing, confidential tone. Though the microphone still carried it to every ear, "Let me give you a piece of advice. You can take this as your expensive lesson for the day, so you don't have to pay a lawyer for it. The world does not care about your artistic merit. It does not care about your dream. It cares about rules. You follow the rules, you get along. You don't, and you end up here. Wasting my time, and the time of everyone in this room?" He gestured around the courtroom, at the board clerk, the tired-looking police officer in the corner, the few other people waiting for their own cases to be heard. Each of them shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with the sisters at the front. The humiliation was no longer just directed at Ilara and Lyra. It was a public performance. They were unwilling actors in a play about their own incompetence. Ilara felt a wave of dizziness. The room felt hot and airless. She could feel a bead of sweat trickle down her back. All her preparation, all her research, all her logical arguments had evaporated into nothingness. She hadn't been given a chance to present them. She hadn't been treated as a business owner with a legitimate grievance. She had been treated like a child who had tracked mud onto a clean floor and was being lectured about it in front of the whole family. The sign is too big. It is not in compliance. That is the beginning and the end of this discussion, the judge declared, his voice booming again. The walk back to their shop was a silent, agonizing journey. The city sounds the rumble of a bus, the distant wail of a siren. The chatter of people on their lunch breaks seemed to belong to a different world, a world that had kept turning while theirs had ground to a halt. Each step felt heavy, weighted down with the judge's words, which echoed in their heads far louder than the city noise. They could feel the eyes of passers beyond them, even though no one was looking. It was the phantom stare of the courtroom, the pitying, curious gazes that had bored into them as they gathered their papers and walked out, heads held high in a desperate attempt to salvage a shred of dignity. Ilara kept her eyes fixed on the cracks in the pavement, counting them as a way to anchor herself, to keep the hot, stinging tears from spilling over. Lyra walked a half-step behind, a silent, fierce shadow, her jaw clenched so tightly it ached. They didn't need to speak. The shared humiliation was a tangible thing between them, a third, oppressive presence. Finally, they reached the familiar, comforting facade of the Gilded Leaf. Its window was filled with neat rows of glass jars containing vibrant herbs and exotic tea blends. The colors a warm and welcome sight. The small, hand-carved sign that had caused all this trouble seemed to mock them from above the door, its golden leaf catching the afternoon sun. With a trembling hand, Ilara unlocked the door, the little bell above it, chiming a cheerful tune that felt completely out of place. They stepped inside, and Lyra immediately turned the lock. Flipping the small, hand-painted open sign to closed, the click of the lock was decisive. A final separation from the outside world. A sanctuary secured, the shop was their refuge. It smelled of dried mint, chamomile, old wood, and the faint, sweet scent of the beeswax polish they used on the shelves. For a long moment they just stood there, breathing in the familiar air, letting the silence of the empty shop wrap around them. The silence was different from the heavy silence of the courtroom. This was a living silence filled with unspoken understanding. Then the dam broke. It wasn't a flood of tears or a torrent of angry words. It was a quiet, controlled shift. Ilara walked behind the long wooden counter, her movements no longer shaky, but purposeful. She knelt down, and with a soft click, unlocked a hidden panel beneath the cash register that looked like just another part of the wood grain. From the dark, concealed space, she pulled out a heavy, leather-bound book. It wasn't a book on botany or tea blending. It was a volume of the state's annotated administrative and procedural law, its pages well-worn and filled with neat marginalia in her own handwriting. She placed it on the counter with a soft thud that seemed to change the very atmosphere of the room. At the same time, Lyra had moved to a small antique desk tucked into a corner of the shop, a space usually used for taking inventory or designing new tea blends. She opened a sleek, silver laptop that looked completely out of place next to the rustic charm of the desk. As it booted up, her fingers flew across the keyboard, not opening a spreadsheet or a design program, but navigating through a series of secure logins. The screen that finally appeared was a dense, intimidating legal research database, the kind that cost thousands of dollars a year to access and was the exclusive domain of top-tier law firms. The facade of the gentle, artistic tea merchants had evaporated, replaced by something else entirely. The cold, focused intensity of two people who were absolutely, terrifyingly in their element. The woman who had stood trembling before the judge was gone. In her place was a legal scholar who had graduated at the top of her class, from one of the most prestigious law schools in the country. The woman who had been silenced with a dismissive wave was now a strategist who had clerked for a Supreme Court justice. Spending a year dissecting the most complex legal arguments in the nation, they had walked away from the golden path, from the offers of six-figure salaries at powerful corporate firms, because they had grown tired of the endless fight, the soulless work, the way the law was often used to crush people rather than to help them. They had wanted to build something real, something beautiful. The Gilded Leaf was their dream, their escape from a world they knew all too well. And Judge Alistair Finch, in his arrogance, had just reached into their sanctuary and dragged them back into it. He didn't just rule against us, Lyra said, her voice low and dangerously calm. Her eyes were fixed on her screen, scanning lines of text at an impossible speed. He violated the state's Code of Judicial Conduct. Canon 2, Section A. A judge shall act at all times in a manner that promotes public confidence in the integrity and impartiality of the judiciary. His public shaming was a textbook violation. Canon 3, Section B. A judge shall be patient, dignified, and courteous to litigants. He was the opposite. Laura ran a finger over the embossed cover of the law book. He also denied us due process. He didn't let us present our case. He made a ruling based on his personal prejudice against us, not on the merits of our appeal. That's an appealable error, but it's not enough. An appeal would just send our case to another judge who might agree with him. We'd be stuck in the same system, fighting the same bias. She looked up, her eyes meeting Lyra's. The hurt and humiliation were still there, buried deep, but now they had been forged into something hard and sharp. He made it personal, Lyra. He didn't just fine us for a sign. He tried to break our spirit in front of a room full of strangers because he decided we weren't worth his time. Lyra stopped typing and looked at her sister, a grim smile touching her lips for the first time all day. Then he made a mistake, she said. A fatal one. He thought we were just two girls with a hobby. He has no idea who he's dealing with. She turned the laptop around so Alara could see the screen. It wasn't the city zoning code on the screen. It was Judge Alistair Finch's official judicial biography, his list of past rulings, his public statements, and a web of connections that was just beginning to take shape. We don't just fight the ruling on the sign. That's small. That's what he expects us to do, what any normal person would do. We change the game. He used his gavel as a weapon. So we use the law as a scalpel. Alara leaned forward, her mind already racing, connecting the dots. The judge's condescending tone, his specific insults, his utter disregard for the facts. It wasn't just random arrogance. It was a pattern, and all patterns once identified can be exploited. She thought of the years they had spent honing their skills, of the sleepless nights preparing for oral arguments, of the complex legal theories they had debated with the sharpest minds in the country. They had put that world behind them, thinking it was a choice. But the judge had just shown them that the world doesn't let you go. It follows you. And now, it was time to remind it of who they were. She opened the heavy law book to a specific page, her finger tracing a line of text. He has a history of rulings against small, independent businesses in that historic district. I remember reading about it when we were preparing our case. A coffee shop, a bookstore, a small art gallery. All lost on procedural grounds, all with the same dismissive language in his opinions. It's not a coincidence. Lyra's fingers were flying across the keyboard again, pulling up case after case. So we start there, she said, her voice filled with a new electric energy. We build a case. Not about our sin. About him. We find out why he's doing this. There's always a reason. Money, power, a personal grudge. Men like him don't act out of pure spite. It's always transactional. She paused, looking at Alara, a shared, dangerous thought passing between them. The air in the shop was no longer just filled with the scent of herbs. It was thick with the promise of a fight, a battle they were born to win. Alara closed the book with a soft, final thud. The decision was made. The dream of a quiet life was over, replaced by the thrill of a challenge they never wanted but were now determined to meet. Then we don't just appeal the sign, she said, her voice clear and steady, filled with a cold fire that the judge had unwittingly ignited. We appeal the judge. The days that followed bled into one another. A seamless cycle of research and revelation that took place entirely within the four walls of their shop. The Gilded Leaf was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a command center. The comforting scent of chamomile and mint was now permanently overlaid with the sterile, electric smell of overheated laptops and the faint, dusty aroma of old legal tomes pulled from their hiding places. The open sign stayed flipped to closed, a silent sentinel guarding their secret war. The world outside, with its simple rhythms of day and night, seemed distant and irrelevant. Their world was now defined by the glow of screens, the frantic clicking of keyboards, and the quiet, shared determination that hummed between them like a live wire. Lyra had transformed the corner desk into a data mining operation. She was a digital archaeologist, carefully excavating the judge's entire public career from the sprawling archives of the internet. Her screen was a mosaic of windows, legal databases, property records, news articles, and corporate filings. She moved through them with an intuitive, almost unconscious grace, her fingers a blur on the keyboard. Her task was monumental. She wasn't just looking for their case. She was pulling every single ruling the judge had made in the last 5 years that related to zoning, commercial permits, or property disputes within their historic district. It was hundreds of cases, a mountain of dry, bureaucratic text that would have buried a lesser researcher. But Lyra was methodical. She created a complex spreadsheet, coding each case with dozens of variables: plaintiff, defendant, type of business, outcome, and most importantly, the specific legal reasoning the judge had used. While Lyra dug, Ilara analyzed. She printed out Lyra's findings, spreading the pages across the large wooden floor of the shop, a chaotic sea of paper that only she could navigate. She paced back and forth, a cup of cold tea forgotten in her hand, her mind working to connect the dots that Lyra uncovered. At first, the pattern was exactly what they expected. A small, independent bookstore wanted to expand its cafe. The judge denied the permit, citing a vague concern for increased foot traffic. A family-owned restaurant put up a new awning. The judge ruled it was non-compliant with historical aesthetic standards and levied a hefty fine. A young artist wanted to convert an old storefront into a studio. The case was tied up in procedural limbo for months, until the artist, drained of funds and hope, gave up. Each case on its own could be dismissed as a tough but fair ruling. A judge being a judge. But seeing them all together spread out on the floor like a gruesome crime scene, a darker picture began to emerge. "It's not just that he rules against them," Ilara said one evening, her voice hoarse from disuse. She pointed a finger at a cluster of documents. "Look at who benefits. The bookstore loses its expansion, and a month later, the property next door is bought by a developer who immediately applies for a variance to build a luxury condo. The restaurant gets fined into submission. And 6 months later, it's out of business, replaced by a generic chain coffee shop that seems to have no trouble getting its permits approved." Lyra looked up from her screen, her eyes tired but sharp. "There's a name that keeps showing up. Not as a defendant, but as the buyer. The developer, it's called Sterling Lang Properties." The name hung in the air. It was a corporate entity, faceless and generic. But to them, it was a ghost starting to take form. "Find them," Ilara said, her voice low and command-like. "Everything. Who owns it? Who runs it? Where did their money come from?" The next phase of their investigation was even more delicate. They weren't just looking at public records anymore. They were digging into the private lives of powerful men. Lyra spent hours navigating corporate registries, tracing shell corporations and parent companies through a labyrinth of financial filings. She found that Sterling Lang was not just one company. It was the tip of an iceberg, a network of smaller LLCs and investment firms, all designed to obscure ownership. But every network has a central point, and after a sleepless night of following digital breadcrumbs, Lyra found it. The CEO of Sterling Lang was a man named Richard Vance, and Richard Vance, Lyra discovered, had a history that stretched back decades. He went to the same law school as the judge, Lyra announced, her voice flat. "Different years, but that's not the connection." She clicked a few more keys, pulling up a faded black and white photograph from a law firm's online archive. It was a group photo from the early 1980s. "Look at this." Lar knelt beside her, peering at the screen. In the photo, a younger, clean-shaven version of the judge stood next to a man with a familiar, smug smile. It was Richard Vance, but it was the third man in the photo, the one standing between them with his arms draped over their shoulders, that made Ilara's breath catch in her throat. "Who is that?" Ilara asked. "The judge's former law partner," Lyra said. "The one who left the firm to go into private consulting 20 years ago. The one whose name is on some of the early, obscure investment documents for one of Sterling Lang's shell corporations." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with a horrifying, satisfying snap. It wasn't about the law. It wasn't about historical aesthetics or zoning regulations. It was about old friends helping each other get rich. The judge was using his gavel not to dispense justice, but as a weapon. He was systematically devaluing properties in the historic district by making it impossible for small, independent owners to succeed. He was strangling them with fines and denials, driving them out of business, clearing the way for his old friend and his crony, Richard Vance, to buy up the properties for pennies on the dollar. Their beautiful hand-carved sign wasn't the target. It was just the latest excuse in a long-running illegal conspiracy. Ilara stood up and walked over to the large, cork-lined wall where they usually pinned pictures of new tea blends. She took a map of their historic district and pinned it to the board. Then, she took a red pin from a small tin and one by one began marking the locations of all the businesses Lyra had identified in her research. The bookstore, the restaurant, the art studio, a dozen more. When she was finished, she stepped back. The red pins formed a clear, undeniable pattern. They were clustered in specific areas, creating a path of destruction that led directly to the heart of the district. It was a map of a planned invasion, and they were the first to see it. The humiliation in the courtroom, the condescending words, the public shaming it, was all just a symptom of a much deeper disease. The judge hadn't just been arrogant. He had been arrogant because he was protected. He was part of a system that believed it was untouchable. He had looked at them and seen two easy victims, two more dots on his map. He had made a mistake, a fatal error in judgment. He had underestimated them. He thought he was dealing with two girls who ran a cute little shop. He had no idea he had just declared war on two of the most brilliant legal minds of their generation. Women who had walked away from that world but now found themselves dragged back into it, armed with more than just passion. They were armed with the truth. And the truth, they now knew, was a weapon. The sisters had found the thread. Now they just had to pull it. The shop was quiet, but it was not a peaceful quiet. It was the tense, humming silence of a watchmaker's workshop, where 1,000 tiny, precise parts must move in perfect synchronization for the clock to strike. The map on the wall, with its constellation of red pins, was no longer just a record of past crimes. It was the blueprint for their response. The sisters knew that having the truth was not enough. The truth was a heavy, unwieldy weapon. It needed to be sharpened, aimed, and fired with perfect precision. A frontal assault would be suicide. There were two unknowns against a man who had spent decades building a fortress of power and influence. He could crush them with a single phone call. So, they would not use a cannon. They would use a scalpel and then a poison dart. Their plan was born over 2 days of near-constant work, fueled by strong black tea and the cold fire of their shared resolve. It was a two-pronged attack, designed to strike at the judge from two directions at once, leaving him with no escape. Ilara would handle the scalpel. Lyra would handle the poison. Ilara's task was to create the legal document, the Trojan horse. She wasn't filing a lawsuit. A lawsuit was public, messy, and would put them directly in the judge's line of fire. Instead, she would draft a formal complaint. A meticulously researched and devastatingly detailed accusation of judicial misconduct. This document would be filed under seal with the state's Judicial Conduct Commission, a powerful but secretive body that investigated judges. It wouldn't be a public spectacle, not at first. It would be a quiet, deadly injection directly into the heart of the system that protected him. For 3 days, she barely left the desk in the corner. The world shrank to the glow of her laptop screen and the soft scratching of her pen on a legal pad. She wrote not like a business owner who had been wronged, but like the brilliant legal mind she was. Her language was precise, clinical, and utterly devoid of emotion. She cited specific statutes, quoted the judge's own rulings back at him, and laid out the pattern of corruption with the cold, hard logic of a mathematical proof. Every allegation was backed by irrefutable evidence, the property records Lyra had found. The old photograph of the judge with Vance, the financial trail connecting the shell corporations. It was a masterpiece of legal argument, a 50-page document that was as beautiful as it was deadly. When she printed the final page, the stack of paper felt heavy in her hands, not with the weight of the paper, but with the weight of a man's career. While Ilara forged the scalpel, Lyra was crafting the poison dart. She knew that the legal route, while essential, would be slow. The commission would investigate quietly, behind closed doors. The judge might never even feel the pressure until it was too late. They needed to apply public pressure to turn the court of public opinion against him. But they couldn't just walk into a newspaper office with their story. They would be dismissed as two bitter women with a grudge. They needed a proxy, a champion whose credibility was beyond question. Lyra spent her time not in legal databases, but in the archives of a major city newspaper. She was looking for a specific kind of journalist, one who had a history of investigative reporting, a reputation for being tenacious, and a few high-profile scalps on his belt, particularly those of corrupt public officials. She found him. A man named Ben Carter. It's a grizzled veteran reporter who had won awards for exposing a city council bribery scandal a few years back. He was known for protecting his sources and for his relentless pursuit of the truth. Contacting him had to be done with absolute care. Lyra created a new, anonymous email account from a public library computer, using a network that couldn't be traced back to them. She didn't send him the entire legal file. That would be overwhelming and could reveal their hand. Instead, she wrote a short, tantalizing email. It was a masterpiece of subtlety. She introduced herself only as a concerned citizen. She didn't mention their shop or their case. She simply laid out a trail of breadcrumbs, hinting at a pattern of judicial misconduct in the historic district, pointing to a few of the other cases Alara had identified, and mentioning the name Sterling Lang Properties. The final line of the email was the hook. This is bigger than one bad ruling. Follow the money from the properties to the developer. Then ask who the developer's old friends are. You might find a story that's worth your time. She sent it from a disposable account that would self-destruct after one use. It was a message in a bottle, cast into a vast digital ocean. With the weapons launched, all they could do was wait. This was, perhaps, the hardest part. The frantic energy of the investigation was replaced by a tense, nerve-wracking calm. They flipped the open sign back to open and tried to resume their lives. But it was like trying to act normal while holding a ticking time bomb. Every time the bell over the door chimed, their hearts would leap. Was it a process server with a subpoena? Was it a private investigator sent by the judge? They served customers with forced smiles, their minds a million miles away, running through scenarios, second-guessing their plan. The humiliation from the courtroom felt like a distant memory, replaced by a new, more acute fear. They weren't just fighting a fine anymore. They were trying to bring down a powerful man, and powerful men do not fall without a fight. A week passed. Then another. They began to wonder if their plan had failed. Maybe the email had been flagged as spam. Maybe the Conduct Commission had filed their complaint in a drawer and forgotten it. Maybe they had overestimated themselves, a pair of tea-sellers playing lawyers in a real-world game with deadly stakes. The doubt was a creeping coldness that seeped into their bones at night. Then one Tuesday morning, it happened. A young college student came into the shop. A regular who always bought a cup of their Focus blend before a big exam. He was staring at his phone, his eyes wide. "Have you seen the news?" he asked, his voice hushed with excitement. He turned the screen towards them. There it was. A headline on the city's most popular news site, written by Ben Carter. It was a bombshell. The article was titled "The Bench and the Bulldozer. A Judge, a Developer, and a District Under Siege." It was everything they had given him and more. Carter had done his own digging, confirming their research and adding even more damning details. The story laid out the entire conspiracy in stark, shocking terms. It named the judge, Richard Vance, and Sterling Lang Properties. It quoted from the rulings against the other small businesses, painting a picture of a systematic, predatory scheme. At the very end of the article, there was a single, devastating paragraph. This investigation was prompted by a tip from a confidential source with intimate knowledge of the situation. A source who chose to remain anonymous for fear of reprisal. Alara and Lyra just stared at the screen, the world tilting on its axis. They had done it. The poisoned dart had found its mark at that exact same moment. In his opulent, wood-paneled office on the top floor of the courthouse, Judge Alistair Finch was taking a sip of his morning coffee. He was feeling good. He had just ruled against another pesky little community garden, clearing the way for a new parking garage. He felt a sense of order, of rightness. His phone buzzed on his desk. It was his clerk, her voice frantic. "Your Honor, you need to see the online news. Right now." He sighed. annoyed by the panic in her tone. He lazily opened the news site on his computer. The headline hit him like a physical blow. The coffee cup slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor, hot liquid splashing across the polished wood. He read the words, his eyes scanning frantically, disbelief turning to cold, sheer terror. He saw his name, Vance's name, the names of the businesses he had crushed. He saw the old photograph from his law firm days, a ghost from a past he thought was long buried. He felt the walls of his fortress, the ones he had spent decades building, crumbling around him. He was a cockroach who had just been exposed to the light. Then his computer pinged. A new email. It was from the clerk of the appellate court. The subject line read, "Matter of the Gilded Leaf versus City Notice of Sealed Filing and Motion for Judicial Review." Clicked it open. It was a copy of the complaint. The 50-page masterpiece. He saw the name at the bottom of the document, the name of the attorney who had filed it. It was a name he didn't recognize, but he knew who was behind it. He saw their faces in his mind's eye, the two identical, nervous-looking girls from the tea shop, the ones he had publicly shamed, the ones he had dismissed. And in that moment of absolute, soul-crushing horror, he finally understood. He hadn't been facing two naive shopkeepers. He had been facing two geniuses, and he had just made the worst mistake of his life. The news did not arrive with a whisper. It was a shout that echoed through the entire city. It was a stone dropped in a still pond, and the ripples spread out in every direction, touching lives the sisters would never even know. In their shop, the two of them stood frozen. The young man's phone held between them, the glowing headline a surreal beacon in the quiet, herbal-scented air. For a moment, there was only the sound of their own hearts beating, a frantic, synchronized rhythm. Then, the world outside crashed back in. The bell above the door chimed, and a woman rushed in, not for tea, but to ask if they had seen the news. A news van parked illegally outside, its satellite dish pointed at the sky like a metal flower. Their quiet sanctuary had become the epicenter of a storm they had created. The judge, meanwhile, was trapped in the eye of that same storm. His office, once a place of quiet authority, had become a cage. His phone had not stopped ringing. It was a shrill, insistent sound, each ring a hammer blow against his composure. He saw the names on the caller ID, colleagues, reporters, the clerk of the appellate court, even a few numbers he didn't recognize but knew would be important. He let it all go to voicemail. He tried to call his old friend, the developer, but the call went straight to a full mailbox. He tried the other one, his former law partner, the man in the photograph. Same thing. He was an island, and the tide was rising fast. He walked to his window and looked down. A swarm of reporters had gathered on the courthouse steps, their cameras pointed up at his office like a firing squad. He stumbled back from the window, his hand trembling as he poured himself a glass of water, spilling most of it on the polished wood. The power he had wielded for decades, the invisible shield that had protected him, had vanished in an instant. He was just a man in a room, a man who had made a terrible, arrogant mistake, and the whole world was watching. The next few days were a blur of headlines and official statements. The Judicial Conduct Commission, now under immense public pressure, announced it was launching a full-scale investigation with the utmost urgency. The State Bar Association opened its own ethical inquiry. His colleagues on the bench, the men and women he had lunched with for years, suddenly had no comment, their eyes averted when he passed them in the hallway. The isolation was the worst part. It was a cold, suffocating blanket. He had built his life on a network of alliances, a web of favors and mutual back-scratching. Now he was caught in his own web, and every strand was snapping. He saw the faces of the two sisters in his mind, not as they were in the courtroom, nervous and defiant, but as he imagined them now, calm, calculating, victorious. They hadn't just beaten him, they had erased him. There was no fight left to be had, no battle to be won. He had lost before he even knew a war had begun. One afternoon, he typed out a short, simple statement. It cited health reasons and a desire not to distract from the important work of the judiciary, and announced his immediate effective retirement. He sent it to a junior reporter at a small online outlet, too ashamed to face the city's major papers. Then he packed a single cardboard box, left his key on his desk, and walked out of the courthouse through a back door, a ghost haunting the halls he once ruled. Weeks turned into a month. The media frenzy died down, replaced by the next scandal, the next big story. For the sisters, the quiet that returned to their shop was different from the tension of before. It was a peaceful, healing quiet. One afternoon, a thick envelope arrived from the city clerk's office. It was a formal notice. In dry, bureaucratic language, it stated that due to the findings of gross judicial misconduct, all rulings made by the former judge in their district over the past 5 years were officially vacated, erased, as if they had never happened. Their fine was gone. The citation for their sign was gone. A separate, smaller envelope arrived a few days later. It was their permit for the sign, approved without question. Lyra took it and, with a small hammer, nailed it to the wall inside their back room, a quiet trophy. There was no champagne, no loud celebration. They just looked at each other, a long, knowing glance that held a universe of emotion, relief, exhaustion, sadness that it had to come to this, and a deep, unshakable sense of rightness. That evening, for the first time in months, they closed the shop at a normal hour and went for a long walk along the river, not talking about the law or corruption, but about the changing color of the leaves and the arrival of the migrating birds. Months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, the sun slanted through the front window of the Gilded Leaf, illuminating the steam rising from a cup of hot cider. The shop was busy, filled with the gentle murmur of conversation and the comforting clink of ceramic mugs. The beautiful hand-carved sign with its golden leaf swung gently in the breeze outside. No longer a symbol of a fight, but just a sign, a welcome. The neighborhood was slowly healing. The bookstore had expanded its cafe. The artist had finally opened her studio. A new community garden was thriving where the parking garage was supposed to go. The sisters were behind the counter, Lara measuring out a blend of peaceful evening tea for an elderly man, Lyra carefully frosting a batch of pumpkin scones. The bell chimed, and a young woman with a nervous but determined expression walked in. She was holding a copy of a law textbook. "Excuse me," she said, her voice a little shaky. "This is going to sound strange, but are you the owners of this shop? The ones from the news story about the judge?" Alara smiled a warm, genuine smile. "We are," she said simply. The young woman's eyes lit up. "I'm a first-year law student," she explained. "And what you did. It just made me believe that maybe this is all worth it. That the law can actually be a tool for good people." It was so inspiring. Lyra stopped frosting the scones and looked over, a soft smile on her face. She walked over to the counter and picked up a small paper cup. "The law is just a bunch of words on a page," she said, her voice quiet but clear as she poured a cup of the steaming cider. "It doesn't have a heart. It doesn't know right from wrong. It only works when the people using it have one." She handed the cup to the student. "It's on the house." The young woman took the cup, her eyes wide. She looked from one sister to the other, seeing not legal geniuses or warriors, but two kind women running a tea shop. She nodded, a look of profound understanding on her face, and found a small table in the corner, opening her textbook. The sisters watched her for a moment, then went back to their work. The great battle was over. They hadn't set out to change the world, only to protect their small corner of it. But in doing so, they had reminded a few people that justice wasn't just something you found in a courtroom. Sometimes it was something you brewed, one cup at a time.